I thought I'd do a series of videos that provide a crash course, if you will, into Ismaili history. And what I want to do in this first video is provide you with a very high-level, cursory overview of some of the main stages of Ismaili history. And then in subsequent videos, I'll dive into each of these stages so that you get more of a feel and more detail on what happened over time. So very roughly speaking, Ismaili history can be divided into four major stages or epochs, and this is typically how historians talk about Ismaili history. So the first of these stages is what I think of as the Early Shia stage, or the stage of Early Shi'ism, and this period really traces back to the original roots of Islam and its early development. Now, from an Ismaili perspective, the most critical moment, the most critical juncture of this period involved a split, a schism between the Shia and the Sunnis. And within that, there were further schisms. Now, the first Shia-Sunni schism came about because after the Prophet had died, peace be upon him, there was a question over who would take over and who would lead the community, not just from a political sense, but whether there was a rightful spiritual successor to the Prophet. And depending on where you fell, you would be either a Shia or a Sunni, very roughly speaking. And then even after that initial schisms, there were actually further schisms. And all these schisms tended to be related to spiritual authority. There was a major schism following the imamate of Ja'far al-Sadiq. And that schism led to the earliest Ismailis. The reason for that is that Ja'far al-Sadiq had a son, Ismail, and there were some people who believed that Ismail was a rightful successor to Ja'far al-Sadiq, and there were others who didn't believe he was a rightful successor. And depending again on where you fell in that thought process, you'd be labeled essentially an Ismaili or not an Ismaili. Now, what was interesting is because of the persecution of the Ismailis at the hands of the Abbasids, a number of early Ismaili imams went into concealment, and that initiated a period that's come to be known as the Dawr al-Satr, or the period of concealment. And in many ways, the period of concealment is really what marks the end of the earliest Shia stage and really starts to mark the beginning of the next major epoch in Ismaili history, which is the Fatimid age. Now, the Fatimid age really commences in about 297 after Hijrah or 909 AD, depending on what calendar you prefer. And the Fatimid age is considered to be, in many ways, the golden age of the Ismailis. And during this time period, during the Fatimid age, the Ismaili imams actually came out of the Dawr al-Satr. They came out of that period of hiding, and they not only began to exercise spiritual authority, but they also began to enjoy and to capture political authority. In fact, they were the caliphs in the areas of North Africa. Now, the Fatimid age itself, we can subdivide it into two periods, what I think of as the early and the later Fatimid age. The early Fatimid age lasted until about 487 after Hijrah, or 1094 AD, and it really culminated with the death of the Ismaili Imam Caliph al-Mustansir. Now, this event is actually very important from an Ismaili perspective, since there was a major split or schism at this point, with one faction following al-Mustansir's son Nizar, and another faction following his other son al-Mustali, who was Nizar's younger brother. And when I say follow, it was a question of who the people believed was the rightful successor to al-Mustansir. Some people believed should be Nizar, others believed it should be al-Mustali. The people who believed that Nizar was the rightful successor, they are now known as the Nizari Ismailis. There were people who believed that al-Mustali should be the successor, and in fact, they have their own groups, some of which are still around today. The Fatimid period itself, you can think of it as culminating or ending in 567 after Hijrah, or 1171 AD. But again, this was not so much the Nizari Ismaili aspect of the Fatimid period, it was the overall Fatimid period, of which the vast majority of that time was under the rule of the Nizari Ismaili Imam Caliphs. So following the end of the Fatimid age, we come to the third major stage of Ismaili history, known as the Alamut Period. And this period really began around 483 after Hijrah, or 1090 in the Common Era. And so really as the Fatimid state was starting to decline, and as the Imam Caliphs, especially the Ismaili Imam Caliphs, began to lose their reign in northern Africa, one particular Ismaili Dai, his name was Hassan bin Sabah, and he's a very important figure in Ismaili history. Hassan bin Sabah established a Nizari Ismaili state at the fortress of Alamut, which is located in northwestern Iran. And this was a Nizari Ismaili state in the sense that Hassan bin Sabah basically abdicated any relationship. He basically withdrew from the Fatimids at that time and really established a state in support of Nizar as the Imam of the Ismailis. Now eventually Nizar's successor to the Imamate, the Imam al-Hadi, moved to Alamut. And the Alamut period in Ismaili history was really, in many ways, about survival. So at this point, the Imams are now in Alamut, and they're really trying to survive because they were still persecuted. And in many ways, the Alamut period, although it was an important period, was one where there was maybe less in terms of literary contributions, less in terms of doctrinal contributions. It was much less prolific compared to the Fatimid period that preceded it. Now, having said that, there were still some important advances in Shia doctrine during that time. In particular, Hassan bin Sabah did push forward a doctrine of talim, or teaching, in that time. So the Alamut period itself came to an end in 654 after Hijrah, or 1256 AD, and it came to an end at the hands of the Mongols, who essentially systematically invaded and took over all the Ismaili strongholds in that region. They were really trying to destroy the Nizari Ismaili state. So that leads us to the final major epic or period in Ismaili history, which is the Post-Alamut, or also sometimes referred to as the modern period. Now, following the destruction of the Nizari state, which was really in the aftermath of the Alamut period, the Nizari Ismaili Imams once again were forced to go into hiding. They had to fear for their lives, and they tried to protect themselves. And at this point, the Nizari community as a whole was really led by local leadership. Peers, mirs, sheikhs, and so on. And this is very important because they were deprived of direct access to their imam, although many of the Ismaili Dais of that time represented the imam, and so the community was often led by local leadership versus being controlled in many ways by the imam directly. Now, this period of hiding lasted until about the middle of the 15th century, and around this time, the Ismaili Imams began to emerge in a place called Anjudan in central Persia. And this period where they emerged, is known as the Anjudan Revival. And this Anjudan Revival period lasted for approximately 2 centuries. And I think of the Anjudan Revival as being the first stage, the first phase of the Post-Alamut period. And the Anjudan Revival then basically led into what we think of as the modern period of Ismaili history. And during this more modern period, the seat of the Ismaili Imamate started to shift away from Persia towards other places like India, and then more recently into Europe. And the efforts of the two most recent Imams, and these were Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III and Maulana Shah Karim al-Husseini Aga Khan IV, who was the present Imam of the Ismailis, their efforts really began to usher in a modern era with regard to the Ismailis. They made a number of highly noteworthy contributions in that context. These Imams, Sultan Muhammad Shah and Shah Karim al-Husseini, established networks of institutions and also policies and projects to improve the overall social welfare of their community. So again, this was a very high-level overview, really covers the major phases, namely the Early Shi'i phase, the Fatimid period, the Alamut period, and then the Post-Alamut or modern period, which are the high-level phases into which historians typically break apart the study of Ismaili history. In subsequent videos, I will talk about these phases in some more detail and provide you with the lay of the land, if you will, for Ismaili history as a whole.